Okay, hi, how's it going? Just wanted to talk a little bit about the Enneagram. First thing is that I think probably I should re-stacking type myself as a social, just kind of because it just kind of fits. I think I've focused a lot on my relationships and how I am with romantic partners, but I'm really not that attentive when I'm in a relationship. I kind of enter a friends with benefits zone with the person, where I connect with them almost like I would a friend, but then we also have sex. It's more that seems to be more my comfort zone than a really deeply romantic, intimate place. And I think it pushes people away. They get to see my tough side as a friend, where I push their buttons and want to have fun and do whatever. But then they also get a full-on intimacy thing. It's speculation. I think a sexual over social could almost work, but I kind of like the idea of going with the social because it's described as more intellectual. And again, it's not a full-on intimacy with me. I'm not as romantic. I kind of struggle with that. And looking at myself in my life, naturally I've gravitated more towards, I've worked as a teacher multiple times. I was a counselor. In my current job, I work in HR for a company that's small, and I also work as a writer. I do a couple jobs, and none of the jobs have paid very well. They fit very much an SP last kind of there because I want to be, because I enjoy it, and I have a sense of mission. So I think really I'm more of a socialite. That's even though I've jumped around with it. It's my typing story is complex. Everybody has a complex typing story. It doesn't have to be a straight line. If it's too straightforward, then I would question it. And I would start to think that maybe the person is doing something similar to what I did, which is falling into an externalized pattern where you're just kind of going with what other people say, or going with what your pressure coerced into, which you would not want to have happen. So, all right, that's about me. The next thing I want to talk about is about the Enneagram itself. I've got an Enneagram shirt on. That's cheesy, but awesome. The point is that the Enneagram is extremely old. It's ancient. It's literally, according to Guedjieff, the oldest religion in the world. And he called it the fourth way, but it's literally the same thing. It describes three ways: the way of the head, the heart, and the body. It translates to the instinctual triads. He had the Enneagram symbol there. Each 9 points were split up. It was all there. Everything was there. All the core material was there. So that allows us to see what's been added and how much room for interpretation there is in those additions. So, first of all, I like to take apart what's been added because basically to summarize what it does is it comes up with very small type boxes. If you can imagine 8 billion people and we're trying to fit people into a box for a type, this is no room to get inconsistent. This is no room. This is not the opportunity to become inconsistent because it's not going to fit people. They're going to be confronted with the system and not find themselves. And it was designed to be a little bit more broad. The trifix was described early on because we have 3 fixations throughout the Enneagram. So it's important to not be too overly specific about how the types appear, how they manifest in a person. You don't want to get too prescriptive about it. That all the 8s look a certain way or all the 2s look a certain way. I think there's been some really nice work done, in the subtypes and wings and trifixes to say, well, look, guys, the types can look very, very different, but it still happens. It's still 1 or 2 books or resources are being over invested in, and everybody is referencing them and saying, well, I read about this and you don't look like that and I don't look like this and that. And pushes them away and they don't understand it because they're not really reading the original material. So if you learn the original material, it's got 9 ideas, 9 fixations. It has the 3 triads. It's got the symbol with lines on it. And the thing I'd like to talk about is what the lines mean. I think that people have come up with different ideas about what the lines mean. I I look at it as something that was there, that was explained, that wasn't explained clearly. We know what the law of 3 is and the law of 7 are. If you study those, how they operate, a little bit about what they mean philosophically. And all of that stuff is plenty to absorb. There's no need to add a gazillion other, hey, different triads, and which have changed over time, by the way. Originally it was the 1 was part of the assertive triad, and the 7 was not. The 7 was in the compliant triad. So, there's been all this movement around over the past few decades, and meanwhile, this is an ancient tool. I mean, it's a religion. It is essentially a religion that kind of goes along with the 7 deadly sins. Of course, there are 2 other ones, but think about what those are. One of them is fear, which is basically doubt or lack of faith, which follows very much from religion. And the other one is deceit or lies. And we hear all the time about how lying is a sin. So ultimately, it's a very much a religious, model about doing the right thing and kind of learning how to be a good person on a deeper level. And I think everyone would agree with that. So the point is that the core ideas, they're fine the way they are. I think that people get too excited adding a gazillion different elements, and now they have to fit a type into all these checkboxes. And it's like, okay, so I have to be a competency type. I have to also be, let's say I'm a 3, I have to be a competency. I also have to be an assertive. And I also have to be an attachment type, which everything has like 5 different names, and it just gets very complicated, and people learn it. I've learned it all, and I know all that stuff, but they don't even learn the original theory. So they're learning stuff that's recent, that's not respecting or even understanding the foundations. So there's no wonder that it's not being understood properly. As far as the directions of integration and disintegration go, I personally don't feel there's a directional flow to it. In my understanding, the way I see it is that we integrate in both directions and we disintegrate in both directions. Movement is possible around the entire thing. There's a bias towards seeing it this way, but that's because both are possible. And if you're just looking for that, you're going to find that. So people are told to look for integration in one direction and disintegration in the other, and they see it. But I'm going to challenge you, and I've talked to other people, and we've all done this. Pretty much everyone I've talked to can see it. And RNH talk about it as the security point, which is like a less healthy version of the integration point, but you can genuinely disintegrate in the direction of your integration point, your so-called integration point. I know because I have a line to 2, and I can be ridiculously like showing up in people's lives with things they don't want, trying to sell them things they don't want, trying to go over the top and smother them with things they never asked for. And I can be in a pretty bad place when I do it emotionally. And it's a disintegration too, certainly. Absolutely 100% it is. What could be called that? The motion can work bilaterally, okay? So that's super important. I think that there are just different schools about, hey, it goes this way or it goes that way. Turns out it can go either way, and that's why there are different schools that think different things. You can trace it back, and there are different theories from other esoteric traditions that would say the mind body that flows in a certain way, one way or the other. You can look at it both ways. So I focus on it both ways. And I've seen myself integrate to type 5, as a core 8. I tend to be impulsive, follow my impulses, do whatever I want to do, and the 5 is about contemplation and thinking things through and being calm and collected and detached, and 8s really benefit from that. So there's a lot of like really one-dimensional stuff, or really, let's just say the core theory as it's implied is complicated enough, but people didn't learn it properly. I don't feel it was learned in its core essence. First, learn it that way, and then look at later stuff and say, well, what was really going on here? Because if you don't do that, you're not actually going to learn it. And if you don't learn it, you're going to be fucked, honestly, because, I mean, seriously, you really genuinely will be pretty screwed over by it. Unless you're willing to go back and look at the original theory and say, okay, I get it now. I was wrong. I learned this later stuff, and this really isn't the Enneagram. This isn't how it was designed. This is a pop modern adaptation of it that is actually very much watered down, or very much adulterated, if you will, and it's actually an occult esoteric system. It's very straightforward. You find your own type, you find your fixation in the other two triads. And there's been amazing work done since then to understand all of that. All of the authors that come after are fantastic. They really are. They're all correct in many ways, but they're not covering the full picture. There's more there. And if you go back to the original model and the early theory, that's where you can find the entirety of it, really. They came up with names later on to describe patterns they were observing, but if you go back farther, think of it as a data point like this, or a circle with all of these lines coming off of it. It all started at this common source, right? That makes the most sense, and that's what happened. And Guedjieff was in the early 1900s, but he studied ancient religions, and he studied the Enneagram from an ancient standpoint. That it goes back to the ancient Egyptians, and it correlates strongly with ideas from that time period, which are thousands of years old. So to then take the last 100 years of modern culture and society and think that it's this new thing, it's not at all. It's not even close to new, and it's important to learn it in its original form. That's why it's so beautiful, because it's simple, and that's going to make it easier to find your type and understand who you are. If you go by later stuff, all the time people online are trying to talk to others about, hey, how do I type myself? Should I use a test? What's a good test? And they desperately want to find their type, but they're already coming at it on this superficial level of not even understanding the core theory. They think a test is going to tell them. The tests are flawed. The tests are subjective, right? You can you can mistype on the test. Every test is different. They're just made up by different people. They don't know about the trifix. They're being fed a wing theory or an instinct theory, which was not core theory. What they should be doing first is learning about the core theory. That's logical. That's how history works. If you're studying anything, you want to study the origin of it. But people ask, well, why is that not happening? It's because it's a cult. A cult means concealed or covered up. It has been occulted. Think about a stack of papers. The very bottom stack, that was the first paper that was laid down. And that's the most important one in this sequence. Let's say that has a number 1 on it. On the very top of the stack, you have, 1,000, the number 1,000. People are only accessing the top, because you have to uncover all this other stuff to get to the bottom. Because when you do a search on Google, you get promotions, you get modern stuff. You don't get the core Enneagram theory. And often people go out of their way to try to explain how the core theory is different, and they really aren't connected, which is a lie. It's a blatant lie. And they are connected. They're exactly the same on a deeper level. And people aren't getting it. And they're thinking, okay, there's this old religious weird tool thing. It really wasn't the modern Enneagram. They're not getting the full picture. It was like Guedjieff did these weird dances and stuff, and it was this Russian thing. And then even the early school in Arica with, Chazo Naranjo is like, it's treated differently, and people see it as something categorically different when it's not. So that's why people aren't understanding. They aren't agreeing on the Enneagram. Some people want to make it scientific. Makes no sense. It's pre-science. I mean, it goes back to ancient times. It's basically philosophy or religion, and it has nothing really to do with science. The only way I could see science working in favor of this is if you could do a brain scan of people and to find patterns. But other than that, it's so subjective. You can't really study it scientifically. It's almost impossible. It's interesting to see people try, but psychology in itself is really a soft science or even a pseudoscience. And the Enneagram and this study of archetypes goes back to ancient times, and it's an elegant, simple system. The lines of integration, they were not given a direction on the diagram. We have the diagram, we have the numbers, we have how they're defined, how Guedjieff defined them and used, ancient principles to define them. They don't have a direction to them. They can be accessed bidirectionally, and the only direction we have is a clockwise enumeration of them, which is a Western, imposed. I think it's a Western, but it's an imposed thing. The sense I get from it is the symmetry of the Enneagram. Look how symmetrical it is. I believe that it was intended to be interpreted both ways. You could write the numbers the other way as long as the internal symmetry of it is kept intact, if that makes sense. And personally, I find it's very, very smart to look at your disintegration point as an integration and vice versa. That's the way to get the most out of that relationship and those pathways. It's also a way to understand the type, that the just as you look at the triad, the instinctual triad, you form a triad of 3. You can also look at your lines and look at that as a kind of a triad. And people have done that, but to look at that is showing a relationship, a triangular relationship, in a sense where you have something in common with both of them. And it's not a positive or negative. It's both. It's a neutral. It can be either or. So that's really what I wanted to say. It's been on my mind for a very, very long time. And I've been practicing it for a while, or trying to. I've known it for a while and talked to others about it. And it seems to be a fact. There's some misinformation there from the R&H school where it's very, people like this. It's simpler for them, easier to learn this. But it's not the way it really manifests. So give it a shot. Access, the high and low side of both. Some sources do a little bit more of that, but there's still this rigid way that people are looking at it, which is like, you need to integrate to I would need to integrate to 2, and there's all this pressure to integrate to 2. It's like, I've disintegrated to 2. I got to where I was so present in other people's lives, they were like, you're suffocating me, get away from me, like I need space. I mean, that has been as much of a problem for me as disintegrating into a dark headspace where I become nihilistic and paranoid and schizophrenic. I mean, both happen. It works both ways. So, all right, thanks for watching. That's what I wanted to say. That was actually pretty long, so I appreciate your time.